Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
There's some incredible TV coming out of the UK right now. Brits just do it differently. The accents, the wit, the scenery, the devastating one-liners disguised as compliments. It's all streaming on BritBox. They have the best mysteries, dramas, comedies, and seriously addicting originals like Outrageous, based on the true story of the Mitford sisters. They were kind of like the Kardashians of the 1930s, wealthy, audacious, chaotic, wildly opinionated, and always making headlines. And chances are you've never heard their story. It's stunning. It's jaw-dropping. It's very British. So check out Outrageous. It could be your next favorite. Don't miss Outrageous, streaming now only on BritBox.
Want to sleep like a pro? There's a reason 80% of NFL players choose Sleep Number smart beds. These game-changing beds automatically contour to your head, neck, and shoulders, delivering MVP-level comfort all night long. Perfect for post-workout recovery, you can adjust the firmness whenever you need, while the climate-cool technology keeps you up to 15 degrees cooler. Plus, it's like having a sleep coach. The bed learns your patterns and provides personalized insights for better sleep. Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed? So you can choose your ideal comfort on either side. The only bed that lets you make each side firmer or softer whenever you like. Your Sleep Number setting. And now, it's the Sleep Number 4th of July sale. Save over $600 on the Sleep Number P5 King Smart Bed, the lowest price of the season. Limited time, exclusively at a Sleep Number store near you. See store or sleepnumber.com for details.
But I think already great strides have been made in supporting victims, helping them with therapy, helping them understand that it wasn't their fault, helping them work through trauma. But I think that the larger thing that needs to happen, and I don't think enough, in fact, I think hardly anything is being done. I think we have to prevent abuse from happening. And I don't mean let's prevent abuse by educating children to this is, don't let someone touch you here. And if someone does touch you here, go tell your mom. I mean, that is obviously extremely important, but I don't think enough is being done to prevent people from becoming abusers. And that's what really bothers me, is that we continue to have these repeat scenarios where and it is mostly men. I always some men get really defensive and they're like, oh, I can't talk about this. I'm too upset to even hear about something like this. And I would never behave that way. So it doesn't concern me. And it's like, well, you know what? Not all men are rapers and abusers. That is true. But all women are targets.
That's Kristin Louise Duncombe, an author and the daughter of a diplomat who chronicles growing up in a close-knit U.S. Embassy community in West Africa where she and many others faced sexual abuse. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. As the daughter of a U.S. diplomat, Kristin Duncombe grew up in various places across Africa and Asia. Because of her own experience growing up internationally, her career focuses mainly on helping international and expatriate individuals and families. She works as a psychotherapist right now. In a memoir called Abject, Kristin tells the story of two timelines: her struggle as a teenager to navigate sexuality and trauma against the backdrop of abuse and what she describes as her older but none the wiser adult self. Kristin was inspired to write her memoir in 2016 when the federal sexual assault case against Larry Nassar, the team doctor of the U.S. women's national gymnastics team, became public. Despite multiple warnings of Nassar's abuse, he was able to continue without repercussions for decades. Kristin recognized the behavior that protected Nassar in her own experience, where a U.S. diplomat was able to get away with sexually predatory behavior despite multiple women, including preteen girls, raising their concerns and stories with government officials. We have seen this play out in a variety of forums, including sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church and in some Protestant churches, as well as the case of film producer Harvey Weinstein, the music producer Sean Diddy Combs, and others. In many ways, Object is a coming-of-age story about a little girl who grows up too fast and of a middle-aged woman who finally begins the process of healing. What I found profound and striking about the book was the silencing of girls and women that persists abroad and in the United States, especially among those who are entrusted to protect the rights of others. The narrative is beautifully crafted. In 1979, Kristin was 10, and she and her family left Washington, D.C. for the Ivory Coast. Her father was a United States Foreign Service officer, and his career would take them all over the globe. Kristin worked to turn her trauma into healing, and eventually something that improved her life and helped others. She studied at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and eventually obtained her master's degrees in public health and clinical social work at Tulane University. She continued to train as a couples therapist at the Couples Institute in Molino Park, California, and trained as a professional life coach at the Coach Training Institute. She now works as a psychotherapist in Paris. Today, we're going to talk about the tendency of those in power to brush off some of the worst behaviors of others. We're going to talk about the impact that that has on the most vulnerable. And we're going to talk about how people who suffer abuse can heal, and also how some of the abusers can be stopped in some unconventional ways. So, Kristin, I just wanted to thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. A friend of mine came across your book and also your story and really encouraged me to have a conversation with you, because a persistent thing that I've thought about is how much suffering goes unaddressed in our society. And I think an easy way to think of that are, things like people who are homeless or, you think the recent American pullback on foreign aid. But I think it goes deeper than that, because a lot of people are in suffering because of silence or because of the things that we ignore. And I think, in thinking about recent things like the worldwide Catholic Church sex abuse scandals, or the story that you bring up about Larry Nassar at the University of Michigan and the national gymnastics team.
Yeah.
Being over and over and over again, institutions and individuals inside those institutions not really addressing things that could truly limit the amount of suffering individuals experience and the number of people who suffer. So I'm really grateful that you wrote your book, and I'm grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about it to a larger audience, because I have been on a mission since publishing the book to try to expose the cover up. And I just have to say, it took me many years to arrive at that place where I felt like I could talk about it, because, and I'm sure we'll get into the details, the silencing that took place was so effective. Even though always knew it was wrong, and even though I never thought for a moment that my abuser, just changed his ways and became a lovely person, I knew, of course, he's still abusing people. I never felt like I could tell anyone about it. And so now that the seal of silence has been broken, I have been trying to spread the word about the story, and also, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about this. I've actually been in communication with people at the State Department to try to get the files from the cover up. But surprise, surprise, no files seem to exist any longer. So I'm sort of back at square one with that. But maybe we'll get into that more a little bit further in our discussion.
One of the interesting things for me, for so many people who experience abuse or exposed to abuse, particularly sexual abuse, it takes so long often for people to even identify or believe that they've been abused. And then there's this next stage, I think, that I often see where it's very difficult to share abuse. And, I get listeners who often write me about this process. And I think for a lot of them, I think it's the realization that it's abuse, the realization that it's likely ongoing. Those can be big factors in people sharing. And then I think another big factor can be it almost provides an opportunity, it seems, for people. And you can definitely see this in the conversations that some of the U.S. gymnasts have had in the Nassar case. It allows them to sort of take their life back in a way.
Yeah,
where it was captured by the abuse, and then they're able to grab their life back.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was wondering, do you think that's the way, or a similar way for you and for those who were affected?
Well, you know what I think is interesting about my story, because you're absolutely right. For a lot of sexual abuse victims, there is a disconnect between understanding that, this thing that happened to me was actually an act of abuse committed against me. Because especially when you're a child and a trusted adult is abusing you, many children, they internalize that, and they feel like, well, I'm somehow complicit in this, or this is a shared responsibility. And I definitely went through some of that. But honestly, the bigger problem in my case, and I can speak for the cohort of victims, there were 7 of us back in the Ivory Coast. So the story is that, my dad was a Foreign Service officer. And so when I was 10 years old, my family was posted to the small U.S. Embassy mission in the Ivory Coast in West Africa. It was a very small, insular American diplomatic community. And one of the senior officials with USAID, William Francis Mulcahy, was actually a rampant serial pedophile, but he was also the love of, no one knew this about him, obviously. He was, everyone's surrogate grandfather. He used to play Santa Claus at the ambassador's Christmas party. He was the quintessential pedophile that groomed the children and the adults alike. He was a super popular figure in the community. And he abused me and 6 other little girls that between the ages of 6 and 12. And it was ongoing for 2 years. And so to go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, when it first started, I was 10. I had absolutely no understanding of sex, this was 1979. So that was a different era as well. Like, no one had ever spoken to me about pedophilia. So it was just an extremely confusing situation. I knew something was wrong. I knew it felt weird. I knew it felt uncomfortable, but I also loved Mr. Mulcahy. I mean, he really was like, he was the fun dad that everyone loved and everyone wished, I wish that was my dad. But as time went on and the abuse was frequent and regular, I would just freeze. I would, when he would come at me to do the variety of things that he used to do to me, I would go into frozen mode. And then as soon as he was done, I would just go back into playful mode. So I knew something was wrong, even though I didn't have the language for it. But what I wanted to say is the reckoning with the abuse actually didn't come from having to, realize like, oh yeah, that actually was wrong what this middle-aged man was doing to 10, 11, and 12-year-old me. The problem is that when the truth was exposed and the community, the embassy community found out that he was molesting a whole bunch of us kids, he was sent back to Washington. And it was the State Department that protected him and told all of our parents, because you can imagine the parents back at the embassy community in the Ivory Coast, everyone was in a complete crisis when they discovered that this man that they had trusted their kids with had been actually abusing them. It was our parents tried to have him prosecuted, and the State Department said, he has diplomatic immunity. There's no federal law against pedophilia, and we need to protect his civil liberties. And so you guys need to just shut up and move on. Like, there's nothing to be done about this. The case is closed. We've removed him from post, so you don't have to deal with him any longer. But that's it. Now move on. So it was a silencing at the level of, the federal government to all of the parents who were trying to stand up for us kids. And everyone fell into place. That's the nature of, I don't know what it would be like in this day and age because times have changed, but I can tell you that was 1982. And it was, obviously there was no email. There wasn't even useful, easy, long distance phone calling. So all of these communications were taking place by telegram. And the parents, our parents were just, they fell into place. They obeyed the big boss, the powers that be at the State Department. And so for me, when I talk about, for many years, I didn't feel like I could talk about this. It wasn't because I didn't know that what had happened to me was wrong. It was that I literally felt like I wasn't allowed. Even though that doesn't make any sense because, just jumping ahead in the story, Mr. Mulcahy was lifted out of my life when I was 12 years old. 10 years later, when I was 22, I was having a series of mental health problems, debilitating mental health problems, all of which could be traced back to the abuse. I had gotten into a series of repeat victimizations, which is very common for abuse survivors. I just could not make good decisions as it pertains to men.
That idea of, and I learned this with first responders. And I remember I was working with a clinical psychiatrist who was also a forensic psychiatrist. And there was this wave of clients that we had, or patients for him, clients for me, who were in the first responder community.
Yeah.
And they would be involved in traumatic incidents, whether it happened to them or it was something that they witnessed. And then we noticed they were recreating that traumatic event, not exactly, they say just like history, it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And he was telling me that is actually one of the really important points because victims of traumatic events feel a loss of control.
Yeah.
And they'll often, not necessarily intentionally, recreate similar situations where they
Yeah.
think they can control them. And you realize over time, as he put it to me, it's not that you walked on a dark alley with a guy. It's not X, Y, or Z that caused it that you think would allow you to assert control. And that until people realize that they're recreating their traumatic incident, just
Yeah.
trying to take control of it, they
Yeah.
end up being doomed to repeat the trauma.
Yeah. It's called repetition compulsion. It's like, as you're saying, you repeat at an unconscious, an unconscious decision or a subconscious series of decisions that you take, but where you keep reenacting the same patterns that get you into similar types of situations, hopefully until you're able to work it out and get a different outcome. But for most people that get into a repetition compulsion, it's, you make the same quote unquote mistake over and over and over and continue to suffer. And what I was going to say about that is that, I was having a lot of problems as a young adult. After the abuse ended, I developed an eating disorder. I developed some addiction problems. I was getting into multiple, as I was saying, repeat victimizations, date rape situations. I just couldn't take care of myself. I was very dysfunctional. And I ended up seeing a therapist I was living in Seattle, Washington at this time. And I saw a therapist at the Sexual Assault Center at Harborview Medical Center. And she encouraged me to get in touch with the State Department to get them to pay for my therapy, because she said they should be paying for this since they didn't do anything to help you when this all happened. And the State Department cut me a check for $20,000. So, so the reason I'm mentioning that is that there was an acknowledgement that this had happened, and
that they accepted some measure of responsibility.
Yes, they accepted some measure of responsibility. The check that they cut me was after they had me file what's called a tort claim. I mean, I didn't know any of this legalese, but they're like, yeah, you have to do a tort claim. I thought it was going to be something.
Which is a civil lawsuit, essentially.
Yeah, well, it was like a 1-page document and that they sent to me and had me fill out. And I filled it out with my therapist, and they had me quantify and qualify all the different types of abuse that I had lived at the hands of Mr. Mulcahy. And I had to estimate the number of times such and such thing had happened. And then I sent it to Washington, and, this was in the early 90s. Like 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail for $20,000, which, going back to what I started with, I told you that I have, since my book has come out, I have tried to get some of the files from the State Department. They don't seem to have any trace of that check either. So I find it just all bizarre. I'm not an investigative journalist, so I don't really know what the next steps are. And unfortunately, as I've started looking into trying to get the files to understand how this cover up was possible, that's when, Trump dismantled USAID. So now things are really in crisis and at the level of USAID, and it feels even more daunting to try to get the information. But I haven't given up yet, and I am going to be looking into it.
It's one of the difficult things about diplomats, and, people don't understand that, let's say, every employee at a U.S. embassy is not a diplomat. Every American isn't. But that with diplomats, they, for understandable reasons, they enjoy immunity from prosecution by local officials.
Yeah.
So in your case, the local officials in Ivory Coast, couldn't prosecute Mulcahy. But
Mulcahy, yeah.
yeah, but one of the things that I think has been a longstanding and you see this with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the French diplomat who
Yeah.
was charged in New York with
Yes.
raping a housekeeper.
Yeah.
That while they may enjoy immunity in the host country, they're still under the jurisdiction of the country they came from. So France was able to prosecute him in their
Yes.
courts. Why didn't the State Department and the U.S. government and the Justice Department make the choice to prosecute him under U.S. laws?
Well, I mean, my first answer to that is because I think the people in charge were extremely feckless and careless and did not think it really mattered. But the official reason is that at that time there was no federal law against pedophilia. And because all of the acts of abuse took place outside of the United States, or at least the ones that they had been made aware of, that's why they said there is no crime to prosecute, because he can't be charged in the Ivory Coast because he has diplomatic immunity, and he can't be charged in the United States because it didn't take place in any particular state. He was an employee of the federal government, and there is no federal law. So there's no case here. But I started out by saying that it's, fecklessness and carelessness, because I think that had the people in charge at the time thought that the fact that this middle-aged man was abusing all these children, if they had treated that with any importance, I think that there would have been a way to charge him with something.
Yeah, I think it was 1977 that the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation Act was passed, which would have served as a vehicle. But, the interesting thing in listening to what you're saying, non-consensual sexual acts have been illegal for a much longer time. And so it sounds like they went into it looking for a way to not charge him as opposed to looking for a way to charge
him. Exactly.
I wanted to jump back and ask you, who was it that first came forward and led to finding out about the other victims and galvanizing the parents?
Yeah,
because
it's a great question.
I think about it and think about there's an element to heroism as a child coming forward, but also for the parents, because, one of the things that people talk about, that sexual abuse, particularly related to children or young adults, doesn't come forward because, a lack of understanding, fear, shame, but also the power dynamics.
Oh,
and there was a risk to the parents too. So I was wondering, who was it that came forward, and how did the galvanizing of the parents happen?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And you know what? The answer just encapsulates what are the dynamics in a small, tight-knit, insular community like the U.S. Embassy community. So, as I was saying, Mr. Mulcahy, he was, a very popular figure in the community, literally played surrogate granddad to families. He would offer to babysit for people. He was always taking us kids to the pool, taking us for ice cream. Everyone just loved him. And the person that broke the seal on what was happening was a new kid, a new family. I won't use their name. In the book, I mostly use real names, except for the victims that I wasn't able to get in touch with and verify whether they wanted to have their real name used. So this particular person, I didn't use her real name. Let's just call her, in the book, I call her Jenny. So this this kid named Jenny moved to Post with her family. She was 10 years old, and they had been in town for like just a few days when Mr. Mulcahy molested her in the swimming pool. And she had no idea who he was because she was new. So she hadn't yet fallen under the influence of, oh, Bill Mulcahy, he's such a hoot. He's so fun. He's so wonderful. And she told her dad immediately, who also wasn't under any sort of, persuasion of Mr. Mulcahy. And he went straight to the security officer at the embassy. And this will just blow your mind when I tell you this. So he went to the security officer, who informed the people in Washington, and rapidly a decision was made that he needed to be repatriated and sent back to Washington. But the other members of the community, so that includes my parents, the parents of all the other victims, no one was informed that this is why he was leaving. Everyone was told that he had been given a promotion. And so my parents and all the community, I like that word you use, they galvanized around the Mulcahy family, helped them pack up their home. And then we literally drove in a convoy to the airport and toasted the Mulcahy family. We toasted Bill Mulcahy with champagne and sent him off back to Washington. And I should mention, if anyone reads the book, you'll see that when you open the book, you'll see a picture of two little girls. Mr. Mulcahy's youngest child was my best friend. We went to the international school together. So, I was at the airport in tears to say goodbye to my best friend, Rose. And no one, in terms of the powers that be in Washington, asked themselves the question of, wow, Mr. Mulcahy, who has been accused of these sex crimes against children, has a 12-year-old girl in his house. So that poor kid got sent back to Washington with her mom and dad. And the whole community waved farewell, toasting Mr. Mulcahy with champagne. And it was only after they were gone, that same day, that then the memo went out that there had been this allegation. And then the parents, and that's actually how my book begins. My book begins with the moment when it's the day that the Mulcahys left, and my parents call me into the living room and say, there's this horrible rumor going around. And now that Rose is gone, and now that the Mulcahys are gone, we want to tell you what it is. And so then they say there's been this accusation that new kid, Jenny, had clearly misunderstood what he had done. And then the question was, you wouldn't know anything about this, would you? And all around the community, parents were having that same conversation with their kids. And all around the community, kids like me were saying, well, actually, it's true. What Jenny said he did is true. He's been doing that to me for like 2 years, and other stuff also. And then all hell broke loose. It was a major community crisis, which in many ways was more traumatic, or I can say traumatic in a different way than to the chronic abuse. Because, the chronic abuse at the hands of Mr. Mulcahy, while uncomfortable, unpleasant, embarrassing, humiliating, the sort of thing that affects a child's self-image, it was insidious. It was quiet. It wasn't violent necessarily. It was sneaky. But when the parents went to pieces and, crying in community meetings and having to talk in a group about, our genitals and what he had done to our genitals. And it was extremely humiliating. So when I talk about that dual layer, I like to talk about the difference between what we call complex trauma and acute trauma, because
Hmm.
for me, that story has the two layers. There's the complex trauma, which, is sort of the developmental wound that comes from that chronic, insidious abuse that really shaped, for me at least, how I felt about myself as a girl and as a person. But the acute trauma was feeling like I had destroyed my parents' mental health because they literally went to pieces. And then insult was added to injury when the State Department just told them to, shut up and move on.
And that's one of the things I think we don't talk about enough, that there is that acute trauma and the complex trauma, layers upon layers, like you're describing. There is the embarrassment and shame about having to talk about it with adults and knowing that other adults that you're not even talking to it about are going to know about it. There's the complexity that gets layered on about the reaction, if the reaction is not helpful and is not affirming. And then there's the complexity, to your point, of the impact on your parents. There can even be complexity in terms of, like you were saying, people liked him, including
they
some
loved
of the
me.
children. Yeah.
They
And then
loved
there's that complexity that me telling this thing is also harming essentially my abuser and my abuser's family. And I think, we've come a long way in terms of understanding that. But in some ways, I still feel like we're really far behind. I think of, as you talked, I was thinking about what happened with Larry Nassar at Michigan State and with gymnastics. And one of the things that I remember about that is it really came to the public consciousness in 2016. And I think it was like August of 2016, because the Indianapolis Star, which is based in the same place in Indianapolis where the U.S. Gymnastics is located, wrote a story about generally the shoddy handling of sex abuse complaints. And then the Star picked up that story very, very intensely. And then between September of that year and September of 2017, more than 100 victims came forward. And it's almost as if Jenny was that same spark, like the Star story was.
Yes.
And then we found out in that, as early as 1997, these acts of abuse have been reported to Michigan State. And it all makes me wonder, in addition to those parallels in terms of that spark and that reaction, why you think that, going back to that 1997 moment, and then also Jenny being the spark, why do you think there's silence before? And why do you think it takes a spark like that, an outcry, to get anyone's attention? And then maybe a third thing that I'm wondering about, how do you think it would have played out if, for example, the Washington Post or the New York Times had caught wind of what was happening at the time, and why maybe nobody went to a newspaper about it?
Well, I think, okay, this is my opinion. What I'm about to say is not necessarily fact-based, but what I think is that things are different now. I think the Me Too movement has done a remarkable service to abuse survivors, because abuse stories are treated with much more seriousness now than they were before, which is not to say that it's perfect. I think there's still plenty of problems of abuse of both children and adults that are not handled properly. But I think back in the day that I'm talking about, so the late 70s, early 1980s, it was just a different era where there wasn't um, there wasn't the knowledge and the savvy about questions of abuse, and I think that men were protected. And I think that people just had no idea how to handle these questions. And because they didn't know how to handle them, I think they also, or rather, I should say, because they were not accustomed to handling them, I think they didn't know how to think about them. And not knowing how to think about them, they did not know how to treat these as matters of importance. I mean, I remember one of my grandparents who knew about what had happened. Um, and I say it like that because, I mean, it just goes to show, abuse stories are so complicated. There was one of my grandparents that we had to keep it a secret from because my parents thought that grandmother would not be able to handle it. And another one of my grandmothers, we had to tell her because she actually lived near to the Mulcahy's family home in Massachusetts. And so my parents had to instruct her that if Mr. Mulcahy got in touch to not provide any information about, us or our whereabouts, if we were going to be in town, et cetera. But I remember what my grandmother said. She treated the abuse story as that he had pinched our bottom. I mean, you can even hear the language. It's a more antiquated way of talking about things. But
A
that
euphemism.
yeah, it's a euphemism that that mom and dad were upset because Mr. Mulcahy pinched my bottom. And he didn't pinch my bottom. He did much worse things than that. But it's that was the early 80s, and that was a 70-something-year-old woman, and the way that she referred to it and the way my parents broke the news to her it just indicates how little language there was for what had happened.
I wonder whether part of it is we struggle as a society with anything that any realities of society that people don't want to talk about or think about. And I think about this in the context of something as simple as my mother dying. And the people who would run into me in places and not know what to say, which actually, in a weird way, that was comforting. But the people who literally would avoid me because they were uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that plays a role in it, because I'm sure I have listeners right now who hopefully have hung on this long that are really struggling to listen to this episode because it's just something they don't want to think about. And I even think about the same thing, and it got a lot of coverage in the Harvey Weinstein case. It's something you want to think about your daughter or your son going out into the world and getting opportunities you don't want to think about. And it reminds me of another thing, your daughter or your son being abused by this person who has power over them that you've entrusted with this opportunity. And I remember in the before 1998, in the Larry Nassar case, one of the fathers committed suicide because of his inability to protect his child from the abuse.
Yeah. No. I you know what? I didn't know that, but I can imagine, and it's awful. And are you familiar with the Giselle Pellicot story?
No.
Okay, so France, where I live in France, and there has been a massive, scandalous, horrible story that was tried in court last summer. It was the rape of a woman named Gisèle Pellicot, who discovered, or rather, I should say, the police discovered that her husband had been drugging her to a state of being comatose over the course of 10 years and then recruiting guys on the internet to come to their home and rape her while he filmed the events. And this was discovered because Dominique Pellicot, the husband, he was in his 70s, was caught doing something called upskirting, meaning he had some sort of recording device. He was walking around the supermarket filming up women's skirts and dresses. And a security guard caught him. And some of the women who Dominique Pellicot had upskirted pressed charges. And when they pressed charges, the police discovered that, 10 years ago, a similar charge had been pressed against Dominique Pellicot. He had upskirted someone 10 years earlier and had walked away with a €250 fine. That was the fine for filming up women's skirts filming up women's skirts 10 years earlier. So he had walked away with no trial, no jail time, just this €250 fine that he had not had to reveal to his wife. And in those 10 years, he had ramped up his behavior. So the police raided the home. They confiscated all of his devices. And it was on the devices that they found something they never would have imagined. They thought they were going to find more upskirting videos, but rather what they found was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of files meticulously organized by Dominique Pellicot. Fortunately for the case, he was this very organized person. All of the files had names like abuse, rape by teenager, rape by electrician, rape by, the tax man. And in the trial in France, they were calling it Monsieur Tout le Monde. That means Mr. Everyone, because there was 51 men. There was files of 51 different perpetrators that Dominique Pellicot had recruited from within a 30-kilometer radius of their family home. And it was everyone from the guy that works in the grocery store to the lawyer, in the next town over. Men ranging in age from, I think, 19 up to 75. Men of all different walks of life.
That is actually the flip side of it. We had a case in Long Island this year, we as in the United States, where a girl was sort of coaxed into going with like a man that she knew. And ultimately the police found her in a houseboat and she had been raped by a bunch of men who were basically recruited by two women and that original man. Not recruited, but I mean, they paid to have sex with her. And what you're saying makes me wonder whether part of the problem is that there are a lot of men and some women who just don't have a problem with the idea of sexual abuse of a child.
Well, yeah. And so what I was going to say about the Gisèle Pellicot trial is that, because
there's also something I wanted to interject that my mother once said to me. Toward the end of my mother's life, she was very open about a bunch of things, and she described what sounded like sexual abuse. And it's nothing she had ever talked about until to her sons. And I don't want to say who, but because she never gave me the name, so it'd be a broad category of people I don't want to paint. But she said this quote that caught me. It was just what happened back then.
Yes, exactly. Guys will pinch your bottom. It's just what happens. Exactly. And
I wanted to ask you something because I was thinking about the story as she told it. And I imagine, thinking about that idea you're talking about complex trauma, that in some ways, Jenny's potential for complex trauma was huge. And the fact that you all came out and said something probably allowed her to avoid one layer of trauma, which was other victims not stepping forward and her potentially being invalidated or dismissed. And
Yes.
I wonder whether that for you guys ended up, even though you may not have intentioned it, being a wonderful gift for her. But I also wonder for you, when you hear about these cases and I know you said things have gotten better, but Nassar or Weinstein, Sean Combs right now,
Yes.
in short,
Yes.
whether is that re-traumatizing that we have not made more progress?
Well, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for me, I mean, is it re-traumatizing? It's more like it's enraging. I feel enraged sometimes when I see how these stories just keep repeating themselves. And, you're absolutely right that I mean, when we were kids, we weren't thinking about it in these terms, and everything blew up so quickly. It was just traumatic. I wasn't thinking about like, oh, well, at least we were able to validate Jenny. But one of the really horrible parts of the Mulcahy story is that I told you how 10 years after the fact, the State Department cut me that check for $20,000. Well, 20 years after the fact, so when I was in my early 30s, one of the fellow victims from the Ivory Coast, another American girl, she found me over the internet and sent me the headline that she discovered while she was standing in line at the grocery store in the Boston area, because that Mulcahy family was originally from Boston, and Mr. Mulcahy had eventually retired from the Foreign Service and retired to Cape Cod and become a Eucharist minister, if you can imagine. So this friend of mine, Francesca, who I hadn't spoken to for years, was standing in line at the grocery store, and she picked up the Boston Herald and sees this headline: ex-Foreign Service officer turned Eucharist minister arrested on Cape Cod for raping an 8-year-old girl.
Hmm.
And so all these years later, he finally got busted and arrested, and he ended up going to jail. But so many people emerged from the woodwork to say, I was a victim too, like the original Me Too. Me Too. He did it to me too. There was all of these people that some of them hadn't even been born yet at the time that he abused me. And if he had been prosecuted, all of these people he went on to abuse, as I was saying, some who hadn't even been born at that time, they would not have been abused, at least not by him. And
And that's an interesting thing that you're really getting at. I think victims, even when they come forward, and when something isn't successful, and often, and I take this from guests that I've had and also from listeners, but there's a sense of guilt almost among them that they couldn't protect other victims,
yeah,
and the knowledge that abusers like this often continue even into late ages,
yeah,
unlike other crimes where we tend to see age stopping them or leading to the people stopping. Um, and that's got to be such a difficult thing to carry. But on the other hand, I also think it inspires people, whether it's an actual crime they're hearing about or the knowledge that these things continue to come forward.
yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I really think in your book, getting into the rationale and understanding of why coming forward can be a benefit for some people and I really recommend everyone read your book, Object. And I'd
Thank
love
you.
to also know if you have any recommendations for other people. But one of the things that I'm wondering about Like, what could what do you think we as society, I say the non-victims, and I say that as a person who myself am a victim of child sexual abuse, and my parents handled it perfectly. But what do you think the broader public can do to help people heal in the meantime? And by meantime, I mean, as we as a society attempt to find better ways to handle these cases, what can we do to help people? What can we say? What can we do? And particularly the people who are in positions of power, who, and I think this is one of the problems, that people in positions of power, often men, often white men, cannot imagine themselves often. And there are some who experience it. We saw that from the Catholic Church scandal. But they often cannot imagine themselves in such a situation. And I think they find it hard to relate to. What do you think can be done?
Honestly, I'm going to give a two-pronged answer, because I think that the thing that is already being done, and I think we can continue to improve how we do this, but I think already great strides have been made in supporting victims, helping them with therapy, helping them understand that it wasn't their fault, helping them work through trauma. But I think that the larger thing that needs to happen, and I don't think enough, in fact, I think hardly anything is being done. I think we have to prevent abuse from happening. And I don't mean let's prevent abuse by educating, children to, like, this is, don't let someone touch you here. And if someone does touch you here, go tell your mom. I mean, that is obviously extremely important, but I don't think enough is being done to prevent people from becoming abusers. And that's what really bothers me, is that we continue to have these repeat scenarios where, and it is mostly men. I always like, some men get really defensive and they're like, oh, I can't talk about this. I'm too upset to even hear about something like this. And I would never behave that way. So it doesn't concern me. And it's like, well, you know what? Not all men are rapers and abusers. That is true. But all women are targets. There's not any woman that doesn't live, and some men also, that live in fear of sexual assault. And so I think that what we need to do as a society is really get all boys and men to feel more implicated in stopping abusive behavior, and more power to guys who wouldn't behave that way. But why are they not speaking out and stopping their brethren from abusive behavior? Sorry.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that I think motivates me to talk about my own abuse. Because one of the things for me that I haven't really talked about, I think, to anyone other than my therapist, is it took me years to get to this point, probably 15, 20 years to get to this point. But I realized that my big concern was not that I'd be abused again. My big concern was that it would transform me into an abuser. And I think that is what has put me on the path to talking about it. Because I've always thought that if I could sit in the room with the person who was an abuser or potentially an abuser, and I could offer them compassion and understanding and help them plot a way to not cause harm, that would be of better benefit.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an extremely brave thing that you're revealing. I mean, honestly, thank you so much for saying that out loud, because I don't think that everyone that has been abused has that fear, but I think some people that have been abused have that fear, especially because, and I think you must be referring to this, most abusers were abused as children. So indeed, it's something that repeats itself. You asked a moment ago, at least I think this was the question, if I had any books to recommend. And I just recently read a very interesting book that addresses this exact question that you're talking about. It's actually, she's a French author, but the book has been translated into so many different languages. In English, it's called Sad Tiger. And it's written by a woman named Nej Sino, Sinno. And she talks about having been abused as a child. And she explores the question of, and she writes these very descriptive passages, like she'll sit at her own daughter's bedside and watch her little sleeping face and try to get into the mind of her abuser. And she articulates how easy it would be in that moment, if she was so inclined, to just repeat what had happened to her to this little child that trusts her completely. She's not an abuser, but she explores that question. And yeah, so what you just
I think it's an important one. I think it's to humble ourselves enough to accept that any of us, even if you didn't experience abuse, any of us are capable of anything.
Well,
And we have a responsibility, or I even think about my boys. One of the important things for me as a parent is to help them learn to treat other people well.
yes.
It's pretty powerful. I think this would be a good time to stop, but I wanted to again recommend to everyone to take a look at your book, Object, a memoir, and give you a chance to offer any closing thoughts you have for people. Particularly I'm interested in what your thoughts would be for those who do suffer from abuse.
Well, I think for me, the most important thing to convey to anyone who has been abused, and wherever you are in that journey of healing, or maybe the abuse is ongoing right now. So, of course, everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different, but what I want to convey is that the wounds that abuse leaves you with do not have to stay open and festering for the rest of your life. The wounds will always be there, but they can heal. And what I would hope for anyone and everyone who has suffered abuse is that you can identify the different ways that the abuse has affected you, like where you're stuck. Like, I know for me, when the healing work that I did, I really realized at a certain moment in my adult experience that psychologically I was stuck at age 10 as it pertained to my relationships with men, and my belief that I was able to decide what was going to happen to me. Once I was able to identify where I was stuck, I was able to really focus on how I needed to heal and the type of things I needed to do to feel solid in my own self-esteem and self-image. And I would hope that for anyone who suffers from developmental wounds as the result of sexual abuse, that you can also get on a path to healing that allows you to live a life in which you feel that you're able to care for yourself and honor yourself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to talk about the story and for your interest. Thank you, Jason. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Awesome. Thank you for joining this conversation with Kristin. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, You can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again in a few days.